Thank you for all of you that are joining us for our first IC Talk of 2021. As I see everyone coming in, I'm going to do the introduction and housekeeping items first. I first want to thank you all that have tuned in from the very beginning. When we first started this series, our goal really was to connect journalists at a time when it really was difficult to do so in person. So now that we're back in 2021, where we have some really exciting sessions that are coming up in the next few months, I want to be sure to mention those at the end of the session today. So please make sure to stay tuned for that. And before we start with our guest today, like I said, I want to go over some housekeeping items with you all. If you have any questions, please make sure to add them in the Q&A portion. I will make sure to unmute you, or my co-chair, Dan Kubisky, who's joining us, will make sure to unmute you so you can ask the question directly to our guest. If you'd like for me to ask the question for you, please make sure to let me know, and I'll be more than happy to do so for you. If you can please leave the chat section for any technical questions, links, and anything that you'd like to add to the conversation in real time, please make sure to do that. My co-chair, Dan, will keep an eye out for that, and he'll be also adding some information there for all of you. Without further ado, let's get to it. Today, we have the pleasure of having the Vice President of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, Eric Wishart, with us. He also serves as the co-chair of its Press Freedom Committee. Eric is a former editor-in-chief of AFP and currently a member of the agency's global news management. He's responsible for special editorial projects. He lectures in journalism at the Hong Kong Baptist University and Hong Kong University, teaching conflict reporting and feature writing. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning and good evening.
And what time is it for you over there right now?
It's 7 a.m. So I've been catching up on what's been happening in America overnight. So what's going on?
I can imagine. I'm really excited to talk to you about that because I feel as if there are parallels between what's happening in Hong Kong and in the US, and get your perspective on that. And as I mentioned, I'm really looking forward to our discussion about Hong Kong. But before we get into that, usually what I like to do, because our audience is usually a mixture of journalists of all different ranges in their careers, I like to start with getting the trajectory of your journalism career. So why did you get into journalism, the process of the opportunities that you've gotten to get to where you are now with the Correspondents Club and then teaching in Hong Kong? Can you let us know about that?
Sure. I mean, I think before I start, actually, I would like to just express on behalf of the Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong our support and solidarity with our colleagues in the United States. I mean, we've been watching the attacks on the press for the past 4 or 5 years from the president, his supporters, and we saw the violence last week. And Donald Trump's attacks in the media have had a global effect, including in this region, and including on a friend of mine, Maria Ressa, as you know, who's facing a jail sentence. So we are just hoping out here that the Biden administration will. We always thought America had our backs, actually, and that's changed in the past 4 years. So we're just hoping under the Biden administration things will change again. But so anyway, with the journalists under attack in America, there's a lot of anger and hate against them. I'd like to say that the Foreign Correspondents Club Hong Kong, we support you. I was always, from the moment I always tell people, from the moment I could read, I was a voracious reader, and from the moment I could write, I was writing stories. So it was all, I suppose it was in my blood. My father was a journalist. He was a features editor of the Glasgow Herald in Scotland, where I come from. So I went straight into journalism from school. I went to journalism school for a year in Edinburgh, and then I joined a group of local newspapers. I was there for about 12 years, did general news reporting, and also was a pop writer. So I interviewed a few stars, Paul McCartney, Johnny Cash, a few big names from the 70s that you might remember. Too young, you're too young to remember them, Mel. And then in 1984, I always wanted to get into international journalism. I joined the AFP, which is based in Paris. AFP goes back to 1835. It's the oldest news agency. Reuters followed, and then the AP. So it's interesting that the three big news agencies still trace their origins back together to the 19th century. So with AFP, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Asia, and then in 1999, I was the first non-French editor-in-chief of AFP. So I did that for 6 years. And so that was the war in Iraq. 9/11, which was my birthday, which you can imagine was quite a thing to get your head around, you know. And then in the news management, my responsibilities include, I'm responsible for the style book. I drew up the ethics code, the AFP charter, and the rules on sourcing. And more recently, I work on that, but I also do quite a lot of speaking about fake news, trust in the media, because there's quite a lot of overlap between the two. So I'm based in Hong Kong. I've been in Hong Kong more or less on and off since, I would say, 2005. So.
Oh, wow. You know, I think that's going to be the next segue into my first question with you, because I feel as if last week, globally, it was very dynamic from the United States over to Hong Kong, the situation in Hong Kong. And I read that with the Associated Press, they reported that 53 activists were arrested under the national security law. So what does that necessarily mean for those of us that are not in the region to experience what's happening in Hong Kong now that the law is in effect? Can you talk about that with us?
Sure. I mean, for those of you who are not everybody's familiar with Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony from the 19th century to 1997. It was, there's about 7.5 million population. It's on the southern coast of China. And when the British handed it back to China in 1997, it was on the basis of an agreement that it would enjoy a high level of autonomy for the next 50 years. And I think there was a belief at the time, I mean, this was negotiated in the year of Deng Xiaoping, that China would continue to liberalize along with its economic development, and that maybe China would be pulled in the Hong Kong direction. Well, the opposite seems to have happened, particularly under President Xi Jinping. There's been quite a tightening up on the mainland, and that has had an effect here. And you have to also realize a lot of people, a lot of families in Hong Kong actually fled the mainland China after 1949 when the communists take over. So there's always been quite a lot of suspicion and animosity towards the mainland in Hong Kong. And so the situation now in 2019, the chief executive, who's essentially not appointed by, there's an election committee, but she's handpicked by Beijing, tried to introduce a law which would allow suspects to be extradited to mainland China, where obviously the legal system is quite different from the legal system in Hong Kong. And this sparked mass protests, which ultimately led to the national security law, which was adopted on June the 30th of last year. So that's the context.
Right. And so how are the Hong Kong journalists dealing with the situation in the region?
Well, I mean, if you read the national security law, and it doesn't take that long, actually, I think it's designed to be vague, okay? I mean, it covers secession, and in the initial protest movement in Hong Kong against the extradition treaty, it sort of morphed into a broader protest movement, and part of the protest movement very lively was calling for independence for Hong Kong, which is an anathema to the Chinese government. And it's also not very practical, but for them, that amounted to secession, the subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign or external forces, which the media tycoon Jimmy Lai has been arrested under. So it had an immediate chilling effect on free speech. And, you know, I know mainland China quite well. You tend to find you work within you're always in a sort of gray area. You're a gray area on the red lines, and they'll tell you can't cross the red lines, but the problem is you only really know you've crossed the red line when it's behind you. So and it's on purpose. So that leads to self-censorship. So that's the kind of atmosphere here.
So we have a question that's just come in from John Carisi. We're going to go ahead and unmute you, John, so you can ask Eric your question directly.
Hi, John.
Hi, how are you, Eric?
Good to talk to you.
Astonishing technology. My question concerns, I call it the long game. Is a complete China takeover of Hong Kong, despite that agreement with Great Britain, inevitable? And if not, how could it be stopped, especially if all independent reporting on what's going on disappears?
Well, to answer your question, it is inevitable. The agreement ends in 2047. So whatever happens, that's the deadline when Hong Kong would be absorbed into mainland China. Now, the question is, what would the government do then? Would they maintain Hong Kong as a special administrative region? Would they extend the current situation for another 50 years? But there's a feeling now with the national security law that 2047's came in 2020. I mean, it really advanced a lot of the concerns people had about the end of that sort of transition period, as it were, in 2047 has happened now. So, and to answer your second question, there's no way of stopping it as far as I can see. I think probably the most optimistic scenario for Hong Kong would be probably a more liberal Chinese government coming into power at some point. But for now, there's no prospect, and there's no international pressure. There's no American or British pressure that's going to change things.
Right. Thank you, John, for your question. So Eric, how has the FCC and the Hong Kong Journalists Association dealt with the situation at hand? Or has there been any threats? What's the situation at hand currently?
Just to explain, well, the Foreign Correspondents Club, we've been in Hong Kong since, we were in mainland China before, and then after the communist takeover in 49, we moved to Hong Kong. We've got about 2,500 members. About 500 are full-time journalists, a mixture of foreign correspondents working for international media and journalists working for the local media. So and the other 2,000 who, we maintain a historic building in the center of Hong Kong, which is expensive to maintain. So we have about 2,000 non-journalists who are members. And I think it also is a big positive that we have such a mixture of people as members. So we're very active in the press freedom front. I mean, I would probably separate the events of the last, what we're looking at, couple of years, roughly 18 months, 2 years, into two different phases. The first was the period of the Hong Kong protests, which began around June of 2019 in a reaction to Carrie Lam's attempt to get this extradition law adopted, which finally failed. Although actually the national security law is more draconian. And there was widespread street protests, which you probably saw on the TV out there as well. And there was a lot of violence towards journalists. There was a lot of pepper spray, water cannon with this stinging dye, I mean, if you saw people who'd been sprayed with this stuff, their skin was scarlet red and stinging. Physical beatings, harassment by the police. The police became extremely aggressive. So at that point, we issued statements condemning it. The Hong Kong Journalists Association did as well. And but I think the most egregious example for me was a journalist I know called Vebi Mega, who's an Indonesian journalist who was covering a protest on a Sunday afternoon on a footbridge. And there were protesters and police. And as the police withdrew, one turned round on the steps and fired within, 10, 15, 20 hit. If you've ever been around anybody who's had that injury, it's a terrible injury, isn't it?
Yes.
The rubber bullet in the eye is a terrible injury. And with complete impunity, we've met the police twice as the FCC. I raised it. They won't name the police officer. Can you imagine that in the United States?
Right.
Won't name the police officer. She's not had her day in court. The legal proceedings so far have gone nowhere. So the big problem for us was the impunity of the police. And the Hong Kong Journalists Association recently took this to a judicial review in the Hong Kong courts over the police violence, which was rejected. So the police managed to basically attack journalists with complete impunity. Yeah. And impunity is a problem, as we know, around the world. And we've met the police, but so that was the protest
Right. And, we had one of our first speakers that we had in our series was Will Ripley from CNN. And I recently, as I was seeing the event unfold last week in DC, I remember seeing him post a photo parallel from the protests in Hong Kong and comparing it to what we were seeing in DC. So I'd love to talk to you about what was your experience like. Last week there were events happening in Hong Kong, but you're also seeing what was unfolding in DC. What was your experience seeing that from the outside, and what was your takeaway from what's happening in the United States?
I mean, I think one part of my responsibility still, but to a greater extent when I was in the Middle East, when I was here, and then when I was editor-in-chief, was journalist safety. And with my team in Paris around 2001, actually, for the war in Afghanistan, we introduced mandatory hostile environment training. So in other words, you don't go to a war, you don't go to a natural disaster if you don't have the equipment, you don't have the training. And the parallel, I would say, in Hong Kong, I mean, they used to call the Hong Kong police Asia's finest. I mean, they were your local friendly policemen, really. And I think it was quite a change. There was a bit of a shock realization that times had changed. These were riot policemen, and riot policemen by nature don't tend to be very friendly. So a lot of journalists weren't really up to speed on this. They were going down to protests without any equipment, in fact, and the legions of amateur journalists who, to me, played an essential role in the coverage. They were armed with their smartphones, and that was all. And without the training, they were rushing in close to the action and were getting hurt. They were getting pepper sprayed. And I mean, America, I think, if you look at what's happened, I mean, even during the presidential election campaign in 2000, and the first when Trump was elected, it had already become a hostile environment. These campaign rallies with Trump had become a hostile environment, and it's only got worse. And so I think looking at the American journalists covering what happened last week, I mean, I know a lot of them carry, helmets and stuff in their backpacks, but I really am concerned that freelancers in particular who don't have the money for the gear or the training are exposed in these situations, both here and in the US and elsewhere. Street violence has become dangerous.
Common, right? It's a common thing that we're seeing in the last few years.
And I think in Hong Kong, we experienced a level of violence, and it was violent on the protester side too. They were throwing petrol bombs. And I think in the United States, you saw the violence. That was unprecedented what happened last week. So I think journalists have got to look at this and say, we're now, and it's going to continue, apparently, according to the FBI, going down to cover these situations. We're going to have to really get proper gear and proper training.
Right. And how important is it with work?
And journalists are no longer collateral damage; they're now targets. I mean, I saw the treatment of the CNN crew in last week. They become targets.
Right, and I remember seeing. I think now this week we're seeing a lot of journalists that were already inside the Capitol when the attack was happening, the riot was happening. That they're starting to share their stories of what that experience was like to be there in real time and to see that unfold and try to be safe as well. And it's it's a terrifying experience just to watch. I can only imagine what it was like to actually be there. And what do you think is the responsibility of organizations and newsrooms when it comes to freelancers of how to prepare them for situations like this? What is there anything the FCC is planning on doing in 2021 to kind of mitigate that?
Well, what we did around the time of the protests, and it's still online. If any of your members, they can look up the FCC site, or they can send me an email and I'll send the links. We held a series of workshops, particularly designed for freelancers, on safety. We had the Wall Street Journal security manager came and gave a 1-hour talk on basic street safety. I mean, what would have worked in last week in Washington, how to deal with crowds, police, what to wear, how to position yourself. We had a session on cybersecurity, a session on the law. So we had a series of workshops, and then after the national security law, we had a panel on what would that mean for journalists? What were the implications for journalists? Which at the time, as I said, because it's such a grey area, wasn't very clear. But so we do that, and we invited members of the Hong Kong Journalists Association. I think that, I mean, AFP, the problem with journalists' safety is it costs money. Okay.
Right.
I mean, it became quite an industry training journalists to cover hostile environments, but I don't know how much it costs in the US. But I mean, you're looking, what, $1,000, $2,000, I would think, for a course. And a lot of freelancers can't afford that. So, but I think news organizations that can afford it should, they should include freelancers, at least their regular freelancers, in their training programs, and also give them equipment.
Right.
I also think this is something that happened to us. James Foley was a contributor to AFP when he was kidnapped and ultimately killed. And what we did, and other news organizations also did under the auspices of the Dart Center, was that we, particularly after what we found in Syria, for example, a lot of freelancers were going in where journalists from established news organizations weren't going anymore because it was too dangerous, but freelancers were still going in. And of course, the cost of being a freelance in a place like Syria has come down a lot, you know, with your, you can edit, you can transmit from wherever. So, and freelancers are always the most exposed. And after James Foley was killed, we brought in a rule that we would no longer take content from freelancers from zones or countries that we would not send our own staff into.
Wow.
Not good enough. You can't say, well, we won't do it, but if you're there, you're a big boy or big girl, we'll take your stuff. We said, no, if it's too dangerous for us, it's too dangerous for you. We did get some pushback from freelancers saying it's not up to you to decide what we do, which is fair enough. But really, if it's too dangerous for AFP or Reuters or AP, you shouldn't be there. So right. I think media has a responsibility. You have a big responsibility to your freelance journalists who are essential. So you can't just say, well, he's just a freelance and it's not my problem. So if they can, they should include their freelancers, their regular freelancers. I suppose everybody that contributes one article can't be included in this, but regular freelancers should be included in training schemes. Because to me, the most exposed are always local journalists, partly because there's more of them, and also, you know, there are fewer people going to stand up for a local journalist than an international journalist. And freelancers are just more exposed, and they really need the support.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more. I think I had the opportunity to get HEFAT training locally here with a news organization. And I think that's so important for news organizations to do that for freelancers. Because you just never know, especially with this last year, where you're going to be, where the dynamic stories will be, and the safety you'll need to be able to cover those stories. So I'd love to kind of go back to the situation from Hong Kong last week. So I wanted to kind of get your understanding of the relationship or the response from the administration or lack thereof. So I know I had read that the Biden administration had brought Anthony Blinken on board for the U.S. Secretary of State last week. He condemned the arrest, and he noted that the Biden-Harris administration is going to stand with the people of Hong Kong and against the Beijing's crackdown on democracy. What are your thoughts about the new administration that's coming in under Biden, and what does this mean for Hong Kong from your perspective?
I mean, the Chinese roundly reject any what they call interference in their internal affairs, and this is not new. This isn't. So they'll just dismiss it. They won't listen. They'll say it's none of your business. We don't stick our nose in your business. You don't stick your nose in our business. But at the same time, they do have ears and they listen. So we really need as much support from the Biden administration as possible. But that's for journalists in general. I mean, Maria Ressa said that the week after Donald Trump called the New York Times fake news, Duterte called Rappler fake news. This has been a direct cause and effect, and it's had a chilling effect in media freedom around the world, and including in Asia. And Trump's fake news mantra has been picked up, as you know. I mean, fake news was, on one hand, originally fake news was just invented stories, disinformation or whatever you want to call it. And under Trump, it became a cudgel with which to attack journalists, and it was gleefully adopted around Asia, and including bringing in so-called fake news laws, which they've even discussed bringing in here. Brought it in Singapore, as you know, and it was brought in Malaysia. So that has to change. Biden has to change that. They have to stand up. I mean, just because China says don't interfere in our affairs, there's absolutely no reason to be silent. So as much support and as much noise that the American administration and as much pressure, good, but at the same time, Jimmy Lai this is where the national security law comes in, because if you call Jimmy Lai, I don't know if you realize that there was a lot of American flags at the demonstrations. The demonstrators here thought that Trump supported the Hong Kong demonstrators, and Jimmy Lai called on Trump and the administration to support him here and support the democracy movement here, and he was accused of inciting foreign collusion. I mean, the security law is quite specific on that. So you're in this gray area. If you talk about these things, are you falling foul of the national security law?
Right.
You've got to, I mean, the climate since June the 30th, the law came in, the climate is, you've got to, does this transgress or not? I think journalists have a lot of, there's still, I mean, this is not mainland China. There's still a lot of freedom of speech in Hong Kong, but it's freedom of speech with limits, and you don't know where the limits are. And Jimmy Lai was arrested. I mean, Jimmy Lai has always been a thorn in the government's flesh. I mean, he fled mainland China as a child and started up the Apple Daily. He's always been a prominent critic of the mainland Chinese government and subsequently the Hong Kong government. So they want to silence him, and they've used the national security law to silence him. And it's been an exercise in silencing him, and also, as we saw, an attack on freedom of the press, because more than 100 police raided his newspaper offices when he was arrested in August. So, yeah, so this is a kind of delicate line. I mean, we want people to speak up in behalf of Hong Kong, but under the national security law, a person like Jimmy Lai has been arrested for collusion. So it's a serious situation. And as I said, we're in gray lines and gray zones and red lines, so it's not very obvious.
Right. And we're seeing so many more people getting arrested. So it's
well,
even,
to give you I mean, we're in the era of people getting arrested, the knock on the door at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. I mean, right. I don't want to give the names, but somebody I know who's a former journalist and became a member of the local legislative council was one of the 53 arrested last week. And the police came to her door, and the helper came to the door. Most people in Hong Kong have a domestic helper. And the police broke the chain in the door, entered the house, and took away their computers, including the computer of her husband, who's a journalist. So that's the climate. That's the climate in Hong Kong. I mean, I think for the national security law, another thing that's important, and this comes also back to the question of freelance, is that I think it was August, a big issue, you probably saw it in the States, I don't know, at these demonstrations, there was dozens and dozens of amateur journalists and student journalists going down. They were wearing these yellow vests, and it was a big part of the story, and they got very essential video. And it also helped the police in some situations, like the first time the policeman shot one of the kids who was demonstrating. You saw the full sequence of events that the police were cornered by a crowd. One of the guys had a hammer. So at least you knew the context. But the police had a big problem with this because they said a lot of them are activists, they're not journalists. Anecdotally, from the journalists I know who went to the protest, they didn't agree. They said the vast majority of these were amateur journalists.
Right.
Obviously driven by, they were quite activist, I would say. They were young and they believed in the cause, but they were down to record it. So the police brought in last August, without any consultation with us or the Hong Kong Journalists Association or the Hong Kong Press Photographers Association, new rules on who they would recognize as journalists. Basically, you either have to be registered with the Government Information Service, which is not that straightforward, or be a recognized foreign media. And the Hong Kong Journalists Association press card, there's no official press card in Hong Kong, was no longer recognized. And this was really, and it was a serious thing to get the Hong Kong Press Association, Hong Kong Journalists Association, sorry, press card. You had to fit certain criteria. You had to prove basically that you were a working journalist, probably a working freelance journalist. So suddenly that card became invalid. And the implications for that, I would say, is twofold. And I don't think we should mix two things up. We're talking accreditation. So for example, there's a difference between, for example, if the police have a briefing and they don't let everybody in, you can't just walk up with your phone and say, I'm a journalist, let me into your briefing. I mean, that's not unusual anywhere. The NYPD issues press credentials. So that, and accreditation of press credentials for specific situations is common everywhere in the world. You can't just go to a sports event and say, I'm a journalist, let me go to this Grand Prix, obviously. However, the danger in this in particular is the police deciding who or not is not a journalist. Most of the demonstrations in Hong Kong are now illegal. If you go to a demonstration as a freelance journalist, if the police turn around and say, well, we don't recognize your Hong Kong Journalists Association card, or you don't have any form of card, you're not a journalist, we'll charge you with illegal assembly. Okay.
Right.
There's a serious legal implication. So you don't want to be, if they don't recognize you as a journalist, you can be arrested as a demonstrator, essentially, or a protester. And these are serious charges now, particularly with the new law. So, and nobody was consulted on this. And we issued a strong statement criticizing it, and got a government statement back. I think it was actually from the Foreign Ministry telling us not to meddle in Hong Kong affairs, which is kind of interesting considering we've been here since we've been in Hong Kong for 70 years. So that was not good.
No.
We're opposed to a national form of press accreditation or a Hong Kong press card, because the danger there is that if you're, for example, the second the government gives you a press card, they can take it off you, as you know. And the political climate here is such that it would be unworkable. And also, for example, in mainland China, your press accreditation is connected to your residency permit. So if you had a press card in Hong Kong, then it could be, if you lost that, then you could lose your residency. So if you were a foreign journalist. So we're opposed to, the general consensus is against a government issued press card, although the government does issue, accreditation to attend its official events.
And have you seen, since the national security law has come into order and now with the press accreditation that you're mentioning, a rise or a decline in the number of foreign correspondents in the region?
I mean, Hong Kong, there's a big number in Hong Kong. I mean, after the national security law was introduced, the New York Times announced it was sending part of its staff to Seoul in South Korea. I think there's a big AFP, Reuters presence. I'm not so sure about AP actually. Bloomberg has a big office here. I would say, I mean, the kind of complicating factor, which is kind of masked the situation, has been the pandemic. Right. So during the protests, a lot of foreign freelancers came in to Hong Kong to cover the protests. And they used and if any of your listeners out there, if you come to Hong Kong, come to the FCC. If you're a journalist, we give you free membership. We have a workroom. It's a very good meeting place. So the FCC Hong Kong became quite a center of activity for foreign freelancers during the protests. One thing I think it's important to say also, slightly talking about mainland China, is that there were expulsions from mainland China last year. But I think one important thing that American journalists have to realize is that a lot of this is tit for tat. The Trump administration has cracked down on Chinese journalists in the United States. Chinese news organizations have been designated as foreign missions, covered under the same sort of legislation as foreign missions. They drastically reduced the length of visas for journalists, Chinese journalists. They actually, some of these news organizations had to reduce their numbers of staff. I think about 100 Chinese journalists had to leave. So a lot of this is tit for tat. So what the Trump administration did to Chinese journalists or Chinese news organizations in the United States had a direct impact on American journalists working in mainland China. The concern which came after that, in one of these waves of expulsions, the Chinese expelled American journalists in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And the Foreign Ministry said they couldn't work in mainland China or Hong Kong and Macau, which was new. This is the first time that you could be kicked out of mainland China and come and work in Hong Kong. So that was the first time we could remember them also, including Hong Kong and Macau. So it's had a direct impact and a very negative impact, because whatever the impact that reducing the Chinese journalist presence in the United States may have had, by having these American journalists expelled from China, it's really reduced the reporting from mainland China. And it's very important that we have a foreign media presence in China. I mean, Xinjiang, the Wuhan, a lot of this was exposed by foreign journalists. So the Trump administration's moves against Chinese press has had a very negative coverage out here on the coverage of China.
Right. And so we have a few questions that have come in. So Hazel Becker wants to know, if it's too dangerous for AFP and Reuters, how will people get information about what's going on there? I think this
no,
is
I didn't say. I said in Syria. I didn't say in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Right. I think this is a reference to when you were talking about when you were working at AFP. If you wouldn't send your own journalists, you wouldn't commission the work from freelancers in that area.
Yeah, foreign freelancers in particular.
Right.
Local is safer because you can. How you do it is you establish relations with local NGOs. There's a lot came out on social media. If you look at the coverage of Syria, a lot of the, like from Aleppo and places like that, I mean, we had a member of the White Helmets, right, in Syria, the NGO, the sort of rescue people who was also working on a freelance basis for AFP. So you reach out to the local community, local bloggers, social media. There was the Syrian Observatory, I think, for Human Rights, who monitored the deaths in Syria. So you rely on local people who they're much less exposed. Obviously, they can't take risks either, but they're not as exposed. There's not a bounty on their head that there would be of a James Foley. So I mean, the social media era has definitely helped us get information from the ground. I mean, a lot of the films of, for example, the gas attacks in Syria were from social media or from the local NGOs. And then obviously then you have to start, you have to verify. I mean, this is where the fact checking comes in. You have to verify the videos, but you get a lot of material out anyway. And if it's safe, sometimes then it will become safe. Certain zones will become safe and you can go in, I mean, it was particularly bad, obviously, when ISIS were there, But as I said, I think it's important that if it's too dangerous for you, it's too dangerous for everybody.
Right. Right. I remember when I was in Jordan, I was covering the conflict.
If you go on, was it Hazel? I think her name was.
Yes.
On the Dart Centre side, or I can send the link. There was actually a joint statement by the news organisations about freelancers, and this was part of it, and also the fact outlining the responsibility of news organisations to their freelance staff.
Right. We also have a message from Eliza Volkman. Eliza, we're going to unmute you and see if you can want to ask your question directly to Eric.
Hi, Eliza.
Hi, it's Alicia Volkman from Tunis. I'm a British journalist, and we have a local association for foreign correspondents, but certainly we've been I think sort of struggling to kind of keep a lot of momentum with
Eliza?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Where did you say you were?
Tunis.
In Tunisia.
Yeah, in Tunisia. So
Hey,
I mean, certainly the past year has been very difficult for press freedom, and certainly governments have taken advantage of the limitation of movements. We had to apply for special permits to cover the initial crisis and lockdown, and a lot of us were denied permits as well. So we've been seeing sort of incremental signs that there could be kind of a change in situation in Tunis. I mean, we're supposed to be celebrating 10 years of democracy and the revolution on January 14th. But we're seeing more and more bloggers being arrested. I've observed trials of activists who've been arrested under defamation laws. What I'm really interested in terms of the situation in Hong Kong, I mean, the encroachment of the mainland Chinese government on Hong Kong is, it's not been just over the last year. I know it's been a good 4 or 5 years. I mean, I used to work there, and I've been to the FCC. I'm interested in just how, because these things they kind of creep along, and it's often a bit more of a boiled frog, and then suddenly you're in a situation that you're describing, where there's violence, targeting of journalists, and so on. Could you describe what, looking back with hindsight, what were the sort of initial symptoms or signs that press freedom was going to be more and more oppressed by the Chinese government? And also my second question is, what's the situation for foreign correspondents? Because it's usually the local correspondents who get it in the net first, and then it's foreign journalists. We saw in Cairo, a number of friends were deported, and now it's a no-go zone.
I'll take the second question first. You're correct. And as you'll have experienced in Tunisia, there's a big difference between the local and international or foreign correspondents. I think the main concern probably for international media here is visas. And there was over the summer, after the national security law was adopted in June the 30th, it seemed everybody's visas slowed up. And the question was, is this because of the national security law? And the FCC actually issued a statement expressing concern over this. Come September, October time, most of the visas were released actually. And so the question, you never know, because immigration departments never say what they're doing. So we didn't know was the delay because of the pandemic and people were working at home, or was it related to the national security law because there was a rumor that there was a new section in the immigration department exclusively dealing with foreign journalist visas? And were they released because of the pressure, because the FCC and others were complaining about it? So, but I think the main concern for international media in Hong Kong is on the visa front. I would say work-wise, we work as quite freely. I think the concern, the tendency to self-censorship is more on the local front. And the slowly boiling the frog, I would say there's, I mean, one thing you have to understand in Hong Kong, there's a lot of people in Hong Kong, a lot of people in the Hong Kong establishment, including the chief executive, who are very pro-Beijing. They're quite happy with what is happening. So this is not an external issue. There's a lot of support for the Beijing government inside Hong Kong, within the police, within the government. So there's been a lot of pressure on RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong, which you'll be familiar with, which is the public broadcaster. You know, the difference, obviously, a state media reflect the position of the government, namely the government mouthpiece, and the public broadcaster gets the money from the government but is independent. And of course, there's always this tension with Mark Thompson, the former Director General of the BBC, on the FCC, in an FCC discussion with me recently, and he talked about the tension between the BBC and the British government. So it's not exclusive to Hong Kong, but there's increasing pressure on RTHK, which is seen quite often as taking an anti-government stance, and there's definite pressure on them to toe the line. So I would say that is your kind of slow simmering frog analogy. But I think people were surprised at the violence against journalists in the protests, but the abrupt change was the national security law. That was a break. That was a chilling. That was not an increment. That was not incremental. That was a line which was crossed. Things were and probably will never be the same. And now you're in a sort of rule by law situation, and it's quite draconian. I mean, there was a RTHK journalist, an investigative reporter, who there was a lot of violence at a train station, an MTR station, in 2019 now, when these thugs came out and attacked demonstrators. And quite recently, she went on to the government website to try to track down who had. There were car number plates she'd identified from the scene, right? And she was trying to find out who owned the cars. And I think she put in a false name. She didn't say she was a journalist. She got 10 police at her door, I think at 7 o'clock in the morning, and arrested her.
That's crazy.
This is against the law. You're not supposed to do it. But I would think in the United States, it would probably be a misdemeanor. This was a show of force, and they hauled her off, right? So, you know, if you step out of line now, you're going to get the knock on the door in the morning. And there's a lot of concern. There's, you know, self-censorship, and another impact of the national security law is that sources are drying up. People are reluctant to go on the record. And it was quite interesting. It was a university in England which has quite a lot of Hong Kong students asked. 2 or 3 weeks ago, they asked me, would I do a talk about press freedom in Hong Kong? And they said to me, you can be anonymous. We can show you in silhouette. Well, with my accent, I think if the police want to, I think the voice recognition wouldn't take very long to track me down. But that just shows you the climate. Obviously, the people they talk to don't want to go on the record.
Absolutely. Well, look, Eric, we have two more questions. I want to make sure we get those in as well. Sure. Before we have 10 minutes left. Okay. Rahma, we are going to unmute you so we can ask your question to Eric.
Hi, Rahma.
Yes, hi, good morning.
Morning.
Okay, my question is, do you think the security law could have been passed if these protests happened during a more friendly administration, like, for example, the Obama administration? And what do you think are some things that the Biden administration can do to improve on journalists, protect journalists?
I think if you looked at the situation in Hong Kong, it was becoming, to be honest, it may have been a good reason or a good pretext to bring in a national security law. I don't know if they had it in the drawer and they were just waiting for the right time. But the situation in Hong Kong, and this is obviously what government here pointed to, it was becoming pretty untenable, actually. I mean, the violence, and this was the thing that surprised people in Hong Kong, was the scale of the violence. I mean, my local, just up the road from where I live, the MTR station, which is a big hub near the airport, was just completely trashed. You know, it got to the point you couldn't go into central Hong Kong at weekends. I mean, so there was a lot of violence. I mean, you didn't need necessarily a national security law to stop it. But I think given the climate, I think it would have been done anyway. I don't think I think the Chinese government, I don't think they would be looking to the United States to act on that. I think they saw a situation where Hong Kong was becoming unmanageable and they stepped in. But as I said, I think for the Biden administration, just in general, America has to change its, I mean, it's going to change overnight, hopefully, but there's been talk that, yeah, but I mean, is Biden going to, I mean, are they going to, is the administration going to have somebody specifically dedicated to press freedom? I mean, there was talk about that. I don't know if he's going to do that, but I mean, it's been so damaging around the world. And in many ways, I would say the fake news rhetoric and the attacks, the enemy of the people has probably had worse impact elsewhere than in Hong Kong, actually. I think the biggest impact really has been, I think the crackdown on Chinese journalists had a very negative effect on foreign American media in mainland China. That was a big negative, and that was the Trump administration.
It looks like we have one more question.
We had Carrie Lam. I mean, she just came out yesterday and said, she just pointed to the United States yesterday. I mean, the inevitable comparisons. She said, well, you know, you criticize us when we crack down on violent protesters, and look at you, you know, these protesters in Hong Kong were pro-democracy protesters, you supported them, and then when it happens in your own backyard, then suddenly it's a terrible thing. So, I mean, you know, America is exposed to that. You know, if they arrest Maria Ressa or any of these governments, they're going to say, well, look at the way the American president talks about journalists. So there's been a direct cause and effect. Inescapable. Yeah.
So we have two more questions, probably about 7 more minutes left. So Hazel, we're going to ask your question. Do you really feel that social media can fill in for professional journalists on the ground who are trained to find the story?
I think it's all part of, I think they all go together. And in a way, this was also the discussion I had with the police here, because the amateurs, for example, were posting, I don't like citizen journalists, particularly as a term, I kind of call them amateur journalists, I suppose you could call them independent journalists. And they were posting on social media, and that was just such an essential part. So yes, I mean, social media have become indispensable to news gathering. And with it, of course, fact checking. I mean, AFP, I mean, I've worked in AFP since 1984, but the days for news agencies, I mean, they still can be first, obviously, if you're in a war zone or away from an urban centre. I mean, apart from maybe a situation like a Syrian civil war, often news agencies will still be first. But in a situation like Hong Kong, so often the first news broke on social media. So social media is becoming an indispensable part of news gathering. But also has fact checking, obviously. I mean, AFP, I think it's got the biggest fact checking network in the world. I mean, it's just an indispensable part now. And I mean, and as I say, these amateurs in Hong Kong, I mean, a lot of the original footage came from them, but they were also getting pepper sprayed because they didn't have the training and they were getting too close to the action.
Right. And we have one final question from Elysia. We're going to go ahead and unmute you.
Thank you.
Hey, Elysia.
Are you there, Elysia?
Hi.
There we go.
I was just reflecting on this sort of conversation and particularly what's been going on. I think in not just the past week, but over the past few years. And certainly I know, having seen the situation in Egypt, the way that sort of unravelled, and it wasn't just local journalists being sort of targeted and arrested. You know, friends of mine were deported. That, you know, the situations can unravel, like you said, very quickly, and that maybe we should be looking to the world, to sort of, I hate the word umbrella organisation, but there is a need for global solidarity and connectivity, and that maybe that's, you know, from this conversation. I mean, it's appalling. What I have such fond memories of working in Hong Kong, and fond memories of going to the FCC. You know, it's why I signed up for this webinar. It just makes me so sad to see this all happening, and it's happening everywhere. I mean, even in the UK, there've been journalists arrested. And, you know, the RSF map is, you know, their usual sort of stock take is quite, you know, depressing each year. So, you know, I wonder if the SPJ, because, you know, we're here under as part of an SPJ event, if there's a way that we can sort of springboard forward and start creating some kind of network of the, you know, different foreign correspondence clubs around the world.
I mean, that's a good point, because we've already, and it's funny, I'm going to a Press Freedom Committee meeting at lunchtime today, actually, and the topic will be our relations with other press clubs in Asia. There's been we signed a joint statement with, which we didn't usually do, actually. We used to kind of avoid that because we like to speak with our own voice, but we worked together with other press clubs in Asia and issued a statement about Hayes Fan, who is the Bloomberg staffer who was arrested about a month or 6 weeks ago in Beijing. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, we would be interested in tying up with the SPJ, and we're developing relations now around the region with the other press clubs. So that is definitely, I mean, why don't you send me an email about that? But we're definitely developing relations, because this is not going to go away, you know.
Absolutely. And, you know, this kind of segues into, I know we have a few more minutes left, and I definitely want to make sure we have one question we always ask all of our guests, and that is, what does press freedom mean to you?
Yeah, you told me that. I mean, I was thinking about it. I mean, obviously, press freedom is a cornerstone of democracy. We all know that. But I would say, and also from the perspective of living here, press freedom and freedom of expression are inseparable from freedom of thought, freedom to think freely. And there's a big drive in Hong Kong to develop patriotism, love of the country. They're bringing in the national curriculum. They want the schools to be much more, you know, to learn about China and develop patriotism. And if you can stifle a free press, you can stifle the way people think. If you stifle press freedom in Hong Kong and ban people from covering certain topics, the effect is on the population that people will stop thinking about them. So this is why press freedom and freedom of expression are essential to not just to democracy, just to discussion and just how your freedom to think and to think about things that governments don't necessarily agree with. And so that's why we absolutely have to defend it. I mean, I said, you know, we get pressure on the FCC. You know, we have a lease, the government as our landlord. Some of our non-journalist members say, well, you know, do you have to issue these statements and it's going to get us in trouble and we could maybe lose. I think the lease is up in a couple of years. And so that I actually wrote a story which you can find on the FCC website. Why do we stand up for press freedom? It's one of our core principles written down in the FCC. And I say silence is not an option. And, you know, silence doesn't work anyway. If we don't issue these statements, you know, it still doesn't mean they're going to necessarily like us. And another point I make is the FCC is not the bricks and mortar. whether or not we have the lease, the FCC will continue to exist. So I think it's essential. That is essential. And I would also say, there's been a lot of sort of schadenfreude, is that a good word? And satisfaction this week at Trump being kicked off of Twitter. I mean, this is a bully public he's used for the last 4 or 5 years or more to push birtherism, to attack journalists, to insult women. I mean, his behavior in Twitter has been abusive Twitter, and finally he's been silenced. And of course, there's a sort of purge now. I'm right. I've just finished a book about fake news and disinformation, and I downloaded Parler on my phone just to watch, and suddenly it's silent.
Right.
I would say, okay, don't cross the lines into incitement of violence and hate speech, but be careful what you wish for, because our biggest nightmare in Hong Kong is that our social media will go silent and that people will be kicked off. And these big tech companies are almost become bigger than governments. So, I mean, I can understand why it was done, but, one day they'll come for you, as we say. And there was a website that is basically gone offline last week in Hong Kong, and we're worried this is going to be the start, because under the national security law, they actually can stop access to websites. So I think this is a big discussion you're going to have in the United States and worldwide. And I think you had Maria Ressa on. I mean, she's extremely critical of the negative role of the big social media platforms. She's been particularly targeted on Facebook. But
Right.
I think once this gets over, I think United States, I think American journalists, and I think, obviously freedom of expression advocates are going to have to take a long, hard look at the implications of this. So, but yeah, press freedom, as I say, silence is not an issue. We got to stand up for press freedom.
Wonderful. So we've come to the end of our conversation. If there's any other questions, please make sure to let us know, email us, and we'll send it over to Eric if you want those answered for you. And Eric, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered that you'd like to discuss before we end our conversation today?
As I say, I would just say that be careful. The most important thing is safety. From what I'm reading, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I don't think this was necessarily a one-off. From what Trump just said, he's unrepentant. So I would really, particularly freelance journalists, I mean, there's a lot of resources available, but I think as I say, you're welcome to send me an email. Go on the FCC website, you can find these workshops. I mean, really prepare. If you go down to these demonstrations, prepare. You can get baseball caps that are actually hard hats. I mean, prepare yourself, because it can get very, very dangerous very quickly. So, you're in a hostile environment. It's changed, as you probably all know. And also, I'm quite active on Twitter. I've not been kicked off Twitter, thankfully. So what I always say, I'm at Eric Wishart. I don't post pictures of my cat and my dog. I tend to focus on press freedom issues, on anything related to disinformation, also Hong Kong. So it's at Eric Wishart on Twitter. And as I always say, if you follow me, I promise to follow you back. Okay.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We thank you so much for having you today. And as promised, I want to make sure I let you guys know about the announcements for our next talk that's going to be taking place. So our next IC talk is addressing race and racism in reporting and in the newsroom, with the editorial director of Stuff in New Zealand, Mark Stevens, and the president and editor of the Kansas City Star, Mike Fannin. From Wellington, New Zealand to Kansas City, Missouri, these editors turn the tables and discuss how and why their respective newspapers looked into reporting and employment practices from the past 100 years. Jesse Holland will be serving as the host, and he is going to be to lead the conversation with the two media leaders and how their news organizations are covering minorities in the past and how media outlets can do better in the future. That's going to be taking place February 2nd. You don't want to miss out on that discussion. We will be sending that registration information, hopefully in the link in the chat and in our newsletter that's going out at the end of the week. So please make sure to sign up for that. You don't want to miss it. Eric, thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to have you back again. And I know I could talk to you for hours, and I would love to do that with you one day.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe, and we will see you February 2nd.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.